Hey Riccardo, thank you so much for sending these images through. It's always a great time to take stock of what we experienced during our week in the southern Serengeti, and I think you'll agree that you've not only learnt a lot, but you've captured some incredible moments. I think we were very fortunate with the sightings, and to match it to the brief of big cat action and getting exposed to so many different opportunities, I think we filled the brief. So without any further ado, let's get stuck into a review of some of these images. Right, if we start with this very first one here, I absolutely love this shot. I mean, number one, lion in a tree, very, very unique, very special, but well captured with a great depth of field at f11 to make sure that we've got depth running throughout the scene here. From a kind of composition perspective, I think it's absolutely perfect. Yes, it is quite a busy scene, but there's nothing that one can do about that. And that's why we've given that extra depth of field to maintain all of that depth, and kind of the line is big enough in the center of the frame to carry you through the rest of that. So from a compositional perspective, I think it's absolutely great. There is one little kind of distracting element here on this right-hand side, so I'd maybe just crop in just a notch to take that away from the corner. The overwhelming kind of impact is that this image has, I'm just going to brighten my screen here, this image has a very warm color cast to it. And by that, if you see, as I change this white balance here, you see that the color temperature across the scene changes, and we get a more accurate kind of reflection here. And the only other thing that I would then look at doing once we've cooled that down, and again, I'm trying to use as many options here to show you how we can manipulate specific colors and elements within the frame, is to increase the saturation of the blues. Now, you may not see it immediately on your side, but I guarantee you if you do this back home on your big screen and then drop maybe the highlights just a little bit, you'll see that there's a little bit more color that starts to come through. And so we've got this green and the blue, whereas beforehand you'll see it's very warm and the background becomes that washed out white color. So globally cooling down the white balance and the color temperature, and then just using our color mixer over here to increase the saturation of the blues. And so before that adjustment, that's kind of what we're looking at there. But a lovely shot. I love the way that the kind of focus is drawn to our subjects immediately, despite it being a relatively busy scene. So very well captured. This is great as well. I love the composition. I love the lineup of the eyes here. The colors of the cheetahs, they also feel a little bit warm. I'm not too sure if you've fiddled with some of the color balance there as well, but in this color mixer, we can change the type of orange that we've got here to be a little bit more kind of reddish or a little bit more yellow. And the saturation that we have, of this one here. So you can see it's quite saturated there. If we go to the hue, we're changing the type of color. So there it's a bit more reddish, there it's a little bit more yellow. And I think it's probably more an adjustment on the hue. And that to me looks like a more natural color, whereas beforehand it was slightly more orange. That's a minor change. In this sort of an image, though, I think the biggest thing is it's more about the kind of content that you have than anything else. But we still got to represent it in an accurate and a good way. So I think that's absolutely perfect. The one little adjustment that I'd like to suggest here is a little bit of a vignette. So this is the darkening of the edges of the frame. So typically what I like to do, I mean, obviously if you go to amount, it becomes quite extreme. I keep the amount quite low. And I like to use the midpoint. And what this does is it pulls the effect towards the center of the frame. So let's have a look here. If I take it from here and I start to pull it in, you'll see it kind of gets pulled in towards the center of the frame. I then like to use a big feather, which if I don't use a feather, it leaves a very hard edge. When I do use a feather, it bleeds that effect out over a much larger area. Now, I've kept the amount where it is just for illustration purposes. So I don't really want you to go in this direction. So now what we do is we can then temper that amount to find the sweet spot, which then allows us to kind of find our happy place. And typically I like to keep this quite subtle, so maybe a value of between 10 and 15. And if you look at that image, you cannot really see the difference. But if I go and switch that off, you see how it just kind of coaches the viewer's eye back in from the edges of the frame and in towards our subject over here. But a lovely storytelling image, very well captured in the midst of chaos. So great shot, very well done. This was such a lovely morning, obviously out in that open area on Ndutu. And I remember processing this with you to a degree whilst we were on safari together. And I think the one thing that I would like to just kind of go into the next level of this is you can see in this background here, it looks a little bit grainy. Obviously, this was taken at an ISO of 2000, and that's not really an issue at all. But one of the things that a lot of people forget to do when they edit is to mask out and sharpen their subject. And if you don't do that, Lightroom is using its algorithm to find edges across the frame where it will sharpen edges. And if we go and have a look at, we open up the detail panel here. Detail, right. Now, sharpening, let's go and put that up at a sort of amount. And I'm going to hold down the option key. And as I do that and I click on this masking option, anything that is white is going to be sharpened. And you can see here, all of that detail in this right-hand corner, there's actually nothing there to sharpen. So what it's sharpening is the noise and the edges of that. So when we start to do this in the very beginning, in the initial process, we're saying to Lightroom, I only want you to sharpen that area which is sharp and in focus, the most prominent edges of the frame, if you will, and focus on those edges. And what you would find is if you do this on the original raw image, that less sharpening would be applied to the background. And in doing that, you're actually going to decrease some of that graininess and noise that you see in the back there. Another little adjustment would be the noise reduction. Now, traditionally, we would just do a kind of luminance noise reduction in here, and that would take away some of the kind of the graininess in the background. And then the color noise reduction, we can adjust, and it would take away the red, green, and blue flecks that one would see. Lightroom does have an AI denoise function, but I want you to kind of play around with this version first before simply jumping into the AI side of things, because I think it'll be quite interesting. But what you need to understand here is that luminance noise refers to the graininess of an image, and color noise refers to the red, green, and blue. So if we just zoom into, let's say, 400% on this, and we zero this noise reduction and the color as well, you see that grain is what we're talking about here. And if we do the luminance reduction all the way up, it takes that graininess away entirely. So we don't want to have that kind of effect, but you can see where it's impacting it. And this has been corrected for color noise reduction. Lightroom does that by standard on import in any case. So, but that's quite a technical evaluation of this one, just give you an idea of that. But overall, a fantastic image, difficult situations, shooting straight into the sun, using a dark background, and then just trying to maintain some of the warmth of the photograph. So very well done overall as well on that shot. This one, kind of polar opposite to the lioness in the tree that we had. If you remember there, I was saying that the image looked quite warm, and in this image, it actually feels quite cool. So if you have a look here from the color temperature side of things, if we now take this temperature and we just warm this image up just a little bit, to something like that, I think that looks a little bit more accurate in terms of what we saw. If I show you the before and after, you can see the color cast changes quite significantly. We do have some bright highlights on the edges of that little lion cub. I can't recover too much more than what I have here, but on the original shot, you may be able to go into that space and recover some of those highlights. And then overall, looking at the histogram, we're just shy of the blacks. And so we could actually then just bring that down just a little bit. And you see that it doesn't, even though our subject is essentially being backlit here, when we drop those blacks, we're not losing detail in the shadows, but it actually just adds a little bit more depth to the scene. So if you have a look here, if we use that as our landing point in our final image, what we had before was that, and this is what we have after. Again, it's a personal taste and a preference. I think it works quite nicely in this image just to bring those blacks down again, looking at the histogram all the way from pure black on this left-hand side to pure white on the right-hand side with a little bit of detail lost in those highlights. So see what you can do about teasing those back on the raw file itself. Right, this image overall, again, quite far to the right-hand side, middle of the day, but I know that you loved this particular shot because of those eyes. And if you have a look here, we don't quite have the pure black either. So two suggestions on this one. The first is to recover some of the highlights, and what that will do is it'll just maintain the integrity of this detail on the coat here. And then looking at the image as a whole, if we drop the exposure slightly, I'd say that looks a little bit more accurate. And then we can just, again, pull down those blacks just a touch. And we have a look at before and after. Do you see how initially in the before shot, the one that you've shared, the subject is quite bright and it almost looks a little bit washed out. But once we've corrected for highlights and the exposure and then a little bit of the blacks, we're able to kind of really bring back all of that detail into the subject. So that is both a visual decision, so looking at the image itself, but also looking at the histogram and seeing how that changes as we make these adjustments. Otherwise, I think a lovely image. I know you liked the footfall and the eyes and also that little tail swishing across. Lovely soft background, shooting with a shallow depth of field at f5.6, blurring that background. Really, really cool. Love it. This was such a cool moment. This was a very, very special sighting. I think we were the first to see these cubs, and the way that we saw them that morning and the amount of time that we got to spend with them, being the only vehicle in that area as well, was fantastic. Very well done to capture this. You can see, I know we spoke quite a bit about depth of field, and you can see how probably your focal point was somewhere down here on either of these two. And you can see even at f9, because we'd given ourselves extra depth of field, these two little guys here in the back are just slightly softer than what we would have wanted. Love the kind of exposure here. The camera would have wanted to show you and lift all of these shadows here, but by underexposing, we keep that rich, warm light and we prevent our subjects from being overexposed. Potentially a option here to do a kind of a 16 by 9 crop and just kind of emphasize the width of the frame, but also looking at it, if you look at the greater sense here, we've got this beautiful water with deep reflections going on there, and because this is a dark part of the frame, we're very much drawn to these lion cubs in the foreground, so not really necessary to go into that 16 by 9 space. Really, really cool. You could potentially, because of that subtle drop off in depth of field, we could go in with a brush and adjust our flow here to about 30 using the numerical key. And what we're going to do is just brush some clarity onto these guys, just to try and bring a little bit more detail back into the frame and make it a little bit easier for our viewers' eyes. So if I overlay to remove the areas that we've selected, and now what I'm going to do is come down to here and apply a little bit more clarity in the hopes that we can kind of add a bit more depth into that. So if we look at before and after, I think it's a very subtle adjustment. It's not over the top, and I think it helps us to achieve the initial objective of having all of these little guys sharp and focus in the frame, despite there being a good, I don't know, half a meter to a little bit more difference between these front ones and the back ones. But a lovely moment, beautiful. Love that we've got all the eyes open and looking at us. Very special. Not always easy to get when you've got multiple subjects like that. This is a lovely tender moment. Obviously, the footfall of this paw and the eye contact from this little cub makes this the center of attention. Looking at this little guy feels a little bit too bright for me. If I come back to the whole image, it just feels slightly bright, and maybe this area here is contributing to that as well. But if I zoom in and I now use my exposure and I'm looking at this little guy, that there looks a little bit better to me. And if I pull back, on a whole, the image looks just that little bit better. So if you have a look here, before and after, I think that's a good adjustment. Now, we spoke a bit about eye mapping as well. So when you first see an image, where does your eye go? And you try and track that natural flow. In this particular image, if you close your eyes and you open again, bang, I go straight to this female because this is large, number one, and this is bright, and then down to this little guy because of the eye contact and the footfall. So what we could even do to try and further enhance the story is just using our brush again with a value of a larger brush and a flow of 40, just working this little patch over there, overlay, come through here, and drop the exposure just a little bit. And look at how that now brings things back into check and balance. So I'm going to cycle through the before and after view. So what we've done there is taken a potentially distracting element in that neck and that white around the fur there and underexposed that just a little bit. Not that it looks odd or unusual in the frame, but just so that in comparison to that little cub's face, it's now a little bit darker. And so when we look at the image, we may go to her chin, but we're not held there nearly as much, and then we drift eventually to this little guy. So as a before and after. It does look as though you may have applied a bit of a vignette to this image already. I can see that there's a bit of a halo around there. So what I'd suggest you do as well, if that is the case, is to remove the vignette from the effects. The reason I'm saying this is the idea of a vignette is great, but it will always draw attention towards the center of the frame because you cannot move a vignette left and right, up and down. However, we can create a vignette essentially using the radial filter tool, so radial gradient, and then rather than having that vignette that you've now got on this frame, look to rather use it around, so we can place this on our subject, which is this little guy. And if we invert that, all right, so now we're working outside of this, and we've got a big circle with a very large feather so that the effect is bled out over a large area. And then we can then start, instead of creating a vignette across the whole image, which dials up the lioness's mouth because it would be dropping off the face of the cub, we're now working around our cub and then dropping off everything else. So let me just show you. It's obviously not going to work as well now because we've got a vignette applied, but the effect is to dial up the presence of that cub whilst dialing down mom. So maybe give that one a rework. If you have applied a vignette, remove it and then rather use a subtle radial gradient around that little cub to draw the attention to the cub. This is a great shot, and the idea here was to kind of really get some blur and separation. I love the colors that you've been able to preserve in these grasses. There are a couple of ways to kind of dial this one up a bit, and I'm going to use a relatively new tool in Lightroom to kind of illustrate this. So I'm going to apply the lens blur function. Now, whilst it busy calculates and does its thing there, essentially this lens blur is allowing you to not shift the depth of field, but really try and blur foreground and background a little bit more around your subject in a linear fashion. So when we set our depth of field, it extends horizontally. We can't have drop off of depth of field on the sides here, and that's where using radial filters and brushes people went wrong. So what this is effectively allowing us to do is control how much depth and blur there is in front of our subject and behind our subject. So if we have a look now at the image, you'll see it's been applied. If I look at before and after, big difference out here in the background. Have a look at this particular area, before and after. It just becomes smoother and softer. Similarly, in the foreground here, before and after, not so much there. So let's have a look. Lightroom now, if I hold down the Option key, I'm essentially deciding where, see how this yellow band creeping in towards the bottom? How much blur is taking effect in this front area. I'm controlling that. And you see that when we get here, it starts to pop up on his forehead as well. Now, we don't want that because that's essentially going to start to blur his face. Now, look at that. That just looks odd. Let me zoom in so that you can see it. Don't go here, okay? So let's leave the foreground alone. And if you have a look then at the background, we're deciding where we want to bring that in. And it's done a pretty good job of mapping out his mane and then blurring the background. So we could leave it somewhere here. And I think that the end result is pretty good. We haven't affected our line. We've softened the background. Have a look over here again. Softened that background a little bit. And we haven't affected our subject in front. But this foreground is still quite hard and edgy. So what I want to do is just soften that. So we've seen that the lens blur has done a great job in the back, but not so good in front because it starts to attract our subject. So what we can do here, because this is a linear feature, we can use a linear gradient and start to work this here. Now, we are working from 100% to 50% to 0 here. And if I then go over overlay, if I use an exposure adjustment, you can see how that works, just to confirm the area that we are working. Now in this space, what we're looking to do is actually drop our clarity. Look at this. See how that softens the foreground a little bit? So we're just softening that a little bit and perhaps even just doing a slight little bit of negative dehaze. And so what we've done here with these adjustments, if we go and have a look at before and after, we've really just made our subject pop out a little bit more by softening these grasses here in the background, most noticeably, and in the foreground. Let's zoom in a little bit here and show you before and after. So you see, we're just kind of softening that background to leave the depth of field band that runs across the frame in place, and our subject is nicely protected and nice and sharp and crisp. So that's what I would do on this one. Otherwise, I think you've done well to preserve highlights, and the colors are absolutely spot on. Beautiful shot. Lovely use of foreground to kind of set the tone of the image. This is beautiful as well. Really like this shot. If anything, there's a couple of white. I think we could tease out some more whites into this image. And you see how this lioness just pops a little bit more by teasing out some of those whites. Lovely soft light, almost getting some color in those eyes, but just not there. And I wouldn't really do too much else to this shot. I think it's really cool. I would have liked just a little bit more beneath her feet. It feels like she's right on the edge there. So if this was a crop, potentially look at just opening that up a little bit. But otherwise, lovely soft light. Love the grasses in the context of where our subject is in this frame. This is great. I think one of the challenges that you had and you expressed was achieving accurate focus. We've moved you onto back button focus, which is a huge step in the right direction. But this is tricky because the camera will always want to jump to these kind of fronds of this sedge grass here. And you've done a really good job to focus beyond that and look at the detail in these club's claws. A lot of people might say and argue, but this is distracting, there's a blade of grass in the way. But for me, these are tiny cubs. This is a kind of secretive moment that we were privileged to, and having that detail across the front of the frame actually adds to the secrecy of the image. So I think it's beautiful. I love the rich colors to this, the moment, the framing, absolutely everything, and then cropping in tight to actually give that feeling of intimacy. So very well done and well processed. I wouldn't change a thing on this one. Very well done. This was a great shot. I remember you pointing this one out. I can use, I think it's good. I think perhaps, if anything, maybe just warming it up slightly to that point. And then maybe just use this as an example to come back to our radial gradient and how we can use that like a vignette is if we draw an area that we're going to select and we kind of take it to shape the giraffe, and we invert this. So we're working outside of this frame now. And we just drop the exposure just by a third. See how that now has brought that in. And up here on this panel, I can switch that off. So see how the giraffe itself, the exposure hasn't changed. We're just working outside of that. But what it has done is it's dialed up the presence of the giraffe in this frame. And you can see the color correction that's taken place, warming this up slightly. And I think that is more accurate. What I love about this image is the kind of foreground here. There was obviously a bush between us and the giraffe. Including that foreground has again given us the sense that we're voyeurs, that we're looking into this frame. So very well done. I do like that shot as well. This is magic. If I close my eyes and open them, there's three things that pull my eye, and two of them are, I think, more manageable than the other. The first one is this bright highlight. Now, this is obviously sunrise, and it's very difficult to recover anything into those highlights. You can see the camera has been able to capture some detail in here, but eventually it just gets blown out into these highlights here, and there's nothing you can do about that. But the two things that have caught my eye is this horn right on the edge, and half of this wildebeest here. So from a cropping perspective, I'd keep the ratios and I'd look to remove that guy on the left-hand side and then take away that horn. Because it's on the edge of the frame and it's a point of contrast against that dust, it immediately catches my eye. So just dialing that back. I know we lose a little bit of the tail there, but I think it makes for a more powerful and clean image. I love the colors and everything else about this image. It was a beautiful moment and not an easy one to capture, and I think you've done a very good job. If the highlight is something that really bugs you, very easy to kind of deal with that is we unlock the ratios that we work with and we start to exclude that. And so all of a sudden we have something that, we don't have those highlights in the background that are that bright patch that's pulling your eye. So that's an alternative. Remember, I've always said that if there's a distracting element, I'd far rather crop it out of the frame than actually try and work around it. And certain things you just simply can't work around. And right, next image, this bloody faced hyena. This is cool. I think ideally, in an ideal world, I would remove the tail of the other wildebeest that's coming through here And if we had just had that wildebeest directly behind the hyena with the hindquarters and everything in the frame, I think it would be maybe a little bit more powerful. However, there is an alternative option on this. So let's have a look here. Just looking at that now. So remember, when we crop something, when we cut a subject off intentionally, we want to try and use a major joint, and in this case it's just behind the shoulder of this wildebeest. If we did anything more on that left hand side, it would look like a bit of a stretch limo. So here things feel a little bit more intentional than if we'd had them kind of like that, I guess, because there it's kind of glaringly obvious that wildebeest has been cropped and lost. I don't know if it would translate into a square crop and make it a little bit more intimate and kind of gory if we did something along these lines. Let's bring this in just a little bit here to make it a little bit more. Now look at this from a rule of thirds perspective. We've got subjects pretty much on the PowerPoint. I don't want to go too much more because then we lose where the feet would be. That's another alternative. Just looking at the overall story here, this tail on the right-hand side. So I guess what I'm saying is have a look at this sequence, see if there's another shot where you've got that wildebeest in the background completely in the frame, because I think that would make for a more powerful image. But a really cool morning. Love the catch light in the hyena's eyes and obviously that bloody neck. These reflections here are very nice. Just wondering if this zebra here on the right has much to add to the frame, and whether we could be better off without him and making this a little different here, removing that leg, that white part of that leg next to the zebra, so that it becomes a little bit more about this guy, and maybe then adding a radial filter around again. So instead of using our vignette, we're just going to use this radial filter to work and dial up certain parts of the frame. And what we're looking to do here is drop the exposure of everything else. And I think that works quite nicely. So using that radial filter there, dropping the exposure on the surrounding areas by almost one full stop. And if we have a look at a before and after, I think that looks quite cool. And obviously as a black and white, this would work very well. Black and whites, we have colors still to work with, so we could drop the blue channel here quite a bit. And you see the changes there. But either way, I think a slightly tighter crop on that one would make things a little bit more interesting. Overall, a very neat collection from a week in the Serengeti, and also really just helping you to get to grips. You mentioned that you hadn't spent a lot of time behind your camera. I do hope that we were able to achieve some of the objectives that you'd set out. I certainly enjoyed hosting you, and it was lovely to share some of the kind of basic things again with people, and to see how quickly you adopted those and picked them up. And I hope that you've seen an improvement in the types of images that you captured during our time together. So yeah, look forward to seeing more, and obviously hosting you on another safari again soon. I do hope that you found this productive. Cheers.